This panel deals with Rosa Luxemburg's Reemergence and focuses on her most important work, The Accumulation of Capital. It was published a century ago, in 1913, and our guiding question is, what does it have to say to us? How does it inform our struggles? And what does it teach us about contemporary globalized capitalism? The accumulation of capital is supposed to be, as its subtitle states, a contribution to the economic theory of imperialism. In her book, Rosa Luxemburg approaches the problem of colonialism and imperialism. She points to limits she sees in Marx's analysis of capitalist development, which did, in her eyes, not provide an explanation for the historical process of imperialism and the making of a capitalist world market. This is an understanding of theory that I and that we at the Foundation feel very close to. Theory not as a production for the ivory tower or as la collage, but as a tool and as a means of informing contemporary struggles.
For those with a socialist politics that is uncompromising in both its commitment to democracy and in its opposition to capitalism, it is common to raise the name of Rosa Luxemburg. A Polish-German secular Jew, a Marxist political economist and political theorist, she was the most prominent leader of the left wing of the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and a founder of the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, and later the Spartacus League and the German Communist Party. Repeatedly jailed for her political activities in both Poland and Germany, she was ultimately murdered with her comrade Karl Liebknecht by the right-wing SPD leadership's militarist Freikorps allies in the aftermath of the failed Spartacus revolt in Berlin in 1919. Luxemburg thus became both a heroine and a martyr of the socialist workers' movement. Though the Communist International, dominated by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, denounced her as a counter-revolutionary Menshevik and sought to eradicate her influence, anti-Stalinist Marxists of various stripes came to her defense, however critically, and would continue to do so in subsequent decades. And even today, more than 94 years after her death, Rosa Luxemburg refuses to die.
Valuable things about this book is, and Rosa Luxemburg's work is, and this is something that feminists have long taken up, is the perspective of enlarged reproduction of capital. That this perspective of the enlarged reproduction of capital takes into account not only the total production of society, in particular, what in rereading Luxemburg for this panel, I noticed also the way that she emphasized the hoard of past labor in the foundation of all present labor that is preserved in fixed capital, which surpasses the volume the labor annually performed for the maintenance of society. These are two things that interest me greatly as a feminist: the past labor and also the labor of maintenance. In the question of accumulation of capital. So, of course, for her, this question of the origin of past labor, she says, is the question of the genesis of capital, which, as we know, is sometimes called the primitive accumulation of capital, which then Harvey takes up and makes into the basis for his retheorization of the accumulation by dispossession. But Rosa Luxemburg herself already pointed out that this is not only historical, meaning to say it wasn't just part of the primitive accumulation phase of capital, but it is also structural and ongoing. This is a very important point. She says it is not only a general condition of a progressive civilization and an expanding population, but also the sine qua non for the economic form of fixed capital, or those means of production which in every society correspond to the fixed capital. And she has a very interesting discussion of fixed capital here, which is also interesting to me, because it does include the historical social setting of capital, and it may be interpreted to also include infrastructure, environment, and ultimately, I will say also, nature. Is that for feminists, the notion of the non-capitalist strata into which the capitalism was expanding didn't only consist of territories, didn't consist only of territories outside of the geographical areas of capitalist accumulation. It also consisted in modes of labor that were not accounted for, particularly the modes of women's labor. So the interpretation of what non-capitalist strata is, to me, is very productive for thinking about why it is that capital survives, why it continues, and how it is that it reforms itself, and what we should be looking for in the contemporary moment, particularly, I think, in the context of what we could call the new political economy of life. And this is the subsumption of life directly as sources of appropriable surplus value.
And what are her contributions to this debate? Now, there's the classical interpretation of Rosa Luxemburg's book, The Accumulation of Capital, which is that if we're looking at expanded reproduction, right, and the organic composition of capital is changing, meaning the capitalists reinvest a portion of the surplus value into their business, then her interpretation of Marx's models in Volume 2 is that there will be underconsumption in the system. Okay, so there is a problem in that the surplus value cannot be realized. All right, and her theory is to explain that capitalism can continue to exist because of the existence of something outside the system, right? A non-capitalist system, and the exchanges which take place between the two systems. So she places the relations between developed and developing countries as central to the continuation of capitalism. Now, if we add a finance circuit to her analysis of Marx's reproduction scheme, which is not something that she's doing. There's no financial sector in Rosa Luxemburg. Her view of money is really, the universal equivalent, it's gold, etc. But if you add in the finance circuit, then you can conceive of another way that you can close the demand gap, and that's credit and finance. You can borrow against the future. So we should not be surprised that the recent crisis originated in a massive expansion of credit for housing, right, facilitated by financial engineering, mortgage-backed securities, etc. That really fits in with her analysis. And her contribution could be that credit is not sustainable because in her numerical examples, if you work through them, and in the class that we did at the Rosa Luxemburg Institute, we did, and that was rather painful. But if you work through her numerical examples, she shows you that that gap, that underconsumption, grows from cycle to cycle. It grows from year to year. So these credit bubbles can compensate, but only for a while, right? At some point, you will find yourself looking at a Minsky type of explanation, which is that there's a tendency in the financial sector to move from sustainable finance, which he calls hedge finance, to something which he calls Ponzi finance, which is you're constantly borrowing to cover both principal and interest, right? So this is not sustainable in the long run, and that's Minsky's approach, and this has been rediscovered after 2008. There was a headline, I think in the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal or something, the Minsky moment, all right? Well, I find echoes of that in Rosa Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital, the growing gap, right, from cycle to cycle.